Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the In Step with God podcast. Today is a special episode. I have 6 people to introduce to you. First is Dr. Jonathan Lamoreaux, a professor in the Religious Studies Department at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. His expertise is in late antiquity, Islamic studies, and Arab Christianity. Then we have Dr. Jill DeTemple, who will forgive me for forgetting her official title in the university system, but she is also a professor in the Religious Studies Department, and her expertise is vast. Then we have Dr. Stephen Long, who was my theology professor and is, I believe, part of the ethics department at SMU. And then we have Dr. Matthew Wilson, who's the director for the Center for Faith and Learning and also a professor in the Political Studies Department. Then we have Reverend Lisa Garvin, who is the university chaplain, and Dr. Ben Voth, who everyone on this podcast has met beforehand for a series on rhetoric and Christianity. He is still a professor of rhetoric at SMU. And I am your host, JT Martin. And holy cow, I managed to do that in 1 minute. So that gives you 2 more time. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn over the speaking to Dr. Jonathan Lamoreaux to kind of kickstart this podcast on the topic of what is a Christian response to Afghanistan. Well, in order to respond to it, we have to know what's going on, and that is where Dr. Jonathan Lamoreaux could not play a more critical role.
All right. Afghanistan has always, since the end of the Second World War, been important to the U.S. Borders on the Soviet Union and Pakistan, which is a key ally of the U.S. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, both the Soviets and the United States pumped enormous amounts of aid into Afghanistan in an attempt to win the hearts and minds. At this point, Afghanistan was a monarchy. There's a long-running joke that the U.S. built all the roads that run east to west, Soviets built all the roads that run north to south. Monarchy falls in the early 70s due to a coup d'etat. Numerous political currents are washing over Afghanistan. You've got multiple versions of Soviet influence communism. You've got political Islamic parties. Anyhow, coup d'etat, early 70s, overthrows the monarchy. And then there's another coup towards the end of the 70s, which brings to power a coalition of 2 communist parties. One ideology is basically Stalinist, and the other has an ideology that's close to Maoism. The chairman is probably legitimately psychopathic, and fighting breaks out between the 2 factions. It's nasty. Soviets decide to intervene in 1979 in December and overthrow the chairman and replace him with a figure who can bring peace between these 2 warring factions of communists. Soviets don't plan to stay. They go in, they assassinate the leader, and they're going to a couple months, but they end up staying about 9 years. They leave behind a government, pulled out in the late 80s, leave behind a government that actually lasts for approximately 2.5 years, but gradually falls to a combination of Islamist forces that are supported mainly by Pakistan, but with money being provided by the Soviet Union and the United States. Pakistan, after the fall of the Soviet puppet regime, as Pakistan would say, Pakistan tried 3 times to take over the country. They supported one faction initially. That didn't work very well. Switched to another faction. Again, that didn't work very well. And eventually ended up sort of supporting the Taliban by 1996. And began as a rural movement in the south that began keeping under control large swaths of Pakistan. About that same time, Al-Qaeda is forced out of Sudan. And these retreats to Afghanistan, where the Taliban give them safe haven. It's a little surprising because Taliban are not Salafist. They're a traditional Hanafi school of law, very different from Islam that you find in Saudi Arabia. They give safe haven to Al Qaeda and continue the work of taking over Afghanistan. By 2001, the U.S. had repeatedly asked the Taliban to hand over bin Laden. After the Afghan bombings, the coal bombings, it's clear that this was Al Qaeda inspired and funded all that. The Taliban refused. Now that had happened. An indication the Taliban knew it was coming, but after 9/11, the U.S. again repeatedly surrendered and refused. So the U.S. intervened in Afghanistan. It's not clear how long the Bush administration planned to stay initially. The Al Qaeda threat in Afghanistan had largely dissipated. By the end of 2001, they fled the country. Pakistan, the Philippines, Yemen. And now the U.S. decides to stay and recreate Afghanistan. We should do something that, and we 20 years. Soviets left behind something for 9 years that lasted 2.5 years. The U.S. government left behind the last 2 days. Falls to the Taliban even before the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Taliban, this is version 2.0. It's really hard to know what exactly is going on in Afghanistan right now because there's so much PR being pumped out by factions that are supporting them and factions that are not supporting them. Literal PR firms in the Gulf and the Pakistan areas, blanketing social media. We don't know what's good. Similarly, it's become a partisan issue in the U.S. and folks on the right are using the chaos withdrawal for their political chaos, and folks on the left are doing the same thing. And then the Trump administration had negotiated a peace treaty, largely peace treaty with Taliban, which ended basically fighting for the Taliban in the U.S. Taliban agreed not to sponsor Al Qaeda or similar organizations that would launch foreign terror attacks. So far, the Taliban give every indication that they'll keep to that agreement. It does seem like they basically control the majority of the country now. There are still some pockets of resistance, but it's hard to know actually how much fighting is going on there. The Taliban are consolidating the last foothold of some territory in the northeast, and they're fighting some Salafist groups in the south. But at this point, it looks like the Taliban are going to take full control of the country, and then it becomes a question whether we recognize the government of Afghanistan. I think if they play their cards right and are in fact a kinder, nicer Taliban, that will happen. There are some good indications that they have moderated. They were extremely sectarian against the Shia minority in the 1990s, but just recently, Taliban provided security for Shia Ashura celebrations and media speeches there. You couldn't have imagined anything like this in the 1990s. But 20% Shia minority, this is really the only major minority in Afghanistan, and it doesn't look like they'll be targeted by the Taliban. Maybe targeted by Salafi groups that are outside the Taliban's control, ISIS-K, which I'm sure we've all heard of by now. But I suspect Taliban will do what they need to do to stomp out those sorts of groups. And then it's kind of a matter of rebuilding Afghanistan. State-sponsored and NGO-sponsored.
So, thank you, Dr. Lamoreaux, for that. Even being in a class that's occupying some of that information, it's still incredible, just kind of the timeline of it all in the process. With that being said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jill DeTemple to kind of talk about NGO response and kind of her thoughts, kind of looking at everything as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. What I'd like to talk about today is why your Facebook feed looks the way it does.
which is right after the U.S. withdrawal. You probably saw some pleading people looking at you on an ad placed in Facebook, asking you to donate to a charity, claiming that they would help somehow in Afghanistan, because that's the way most of us in the United States actually interact with this crisis. But I think we aren't really well informed about what that looks like, and so what I'm hoping to do for the next few minutes is just talk about what that is a little bit. So by one estimate, there are more than 2,400 non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, in Afghanistan. And that's an estimate because nobody actually knows. Because of all the chaos that Dr. Lamoreaux was just talking about, there isn't great record keeping. The other issue with NGOs is they range from large NGOs, something you might recognize like World Vision or Tear Fund or something, to smaller local NGOs, to now something we're starting to talk about in circles that I run in, especially sociologists, as micro NGOs. These are the tiny little organizations put together by people with a cause. They might take $5,000 overseas and set something up. These are not well tracked. So when we're talking about NGOs and what happens in crises like this, we're talking about a lot of different things. The other thing I think it's important to know is that even where the United States is involved in foreign aid to a country, and especially to Afghanistan, even outside of military operations, a lot of times that aid is not direct, but it gets funneled through those NGOs. And this is not a new thing. Western aid in Afghanistan has been happening since the 1990s, although the NGO sort of situation we recognize now has been established since 2001. When the U.S. military operations started, the NGOs were right behind it, and sometimes working together. So a few major players you might recognize, and these are the ones who are still there so far as we can tell, that they have not withdrawn. A lot of the smaller ones just got out. They were on the planes getting out of the Kabul airport. But currently, as of today, the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies still has operations. Doctors Without Borders is still there. CARE International is there. And then also a host of faith-based organizations. And that's really where I'll start talking about. So World Vision, Mercy Corps, Tear Fund. They also have some small operations in the country, most of them in Kabul, but in a few other small places as well. One of the biggest players in the NGO player world is Islamic Relief, which is the largest Muslim aid and relief agency in the world. And we're currently raising $2.1 million for efforts in Afghanistan and also for Afghan refugees in the U.S. Islamic Relief is actually based in London, but they do work all over the place. And they have been working in Afghanistan for 20 years, again, about the same time as most of these larger NGOs who came in after the U.S. occupation. The United States Agency for International Development funds Islamic Relief. Again, there's a lot of funneling of U.S. tax dollars that goes on that keeps a lot of these NGOs alive. Most of the NGOs, the big ones I just listed, World Vision, Mercy Corps, Tear Fund, well, not Tear Fund, they're a British organization, but U.S.-based, and sometimes not U.S.-based. Places like Islamic Relief take at least 45% of their funding from USAID. This happens for a lot of reasons. It started happening in the 90s when the way the United States started seeing development, and especially nation-building operations, changed after the fall of the Berlin Wall. When the Cold War effectively ended, the military was no longer seen as our best line of nation building. This, along with some neoliberal policies, started the incursion of funds into private organizations. So again, a lot is happening here. We have a lot of different structures, a lot of people trying to work, and they're the ones who are advertising to you on Facebook because they need more funds than they're getting to rise up to the occasion with all the things they're trying to do, both aid relief or disaster relief currently in Afghanistan, as stuff got blown up. Last few weeks, people need water again and they need electricity. I was reading one place, there are places that haven't had electricity now for months. Water is also an issue, basic medical care. Then there are organizations who also want to target building up again schools, civil society of various kinds. So these organizations are involved in that work. So why does this matter? The topic for today, as I understand it, is how Christians should respond to the crises in Afghanistan. And one mode of response, and again a popular one, is just to give money to organizations working on the ground. Most of us aren't going to go to Afghanistan. Instead, resources go. Christian philanthropy is a big deal, actually, on the global stage, worth $88.55 billion. That is a lot of money, some of which will go to Afghanistan. So of that $88.55 billion, a lot of it goes to home churches, but a good portion of it, again, goes either directly or indirectly to NGOs. That's where I'd like to focus the rest of my time today, is talking about which NGO it should go to and why that matters. There are lots of people who write about this, but here are some questions that they ask that you might find relevant. It's worth thinking about the goal of giving. Right? Is it to further specifically Christian causes for co-religionists? If so, Afghanistan would seem to be a poor target. There are very few Christians in Afghanistan. Do people feel called for religious reasons to offer aid and relief? Are folks called to help Afghans build a sustainable and equitable society? All of those things, I think, can be considered Christian ideas and could, for some, missions more aimed at proselytizing. And some of those certainly exist in Afghanistan as well. But that's where the stuff gets sticky. There is a relationship between religion and effective aid programs. We know that development works best when it is done in consultation with local people who have direct input into what they want and need. That may be, again, health clinics, water systems, educational opportunities. People also generally want this in ways that will allow them to maintain and strengthen religious and cultural identities. Good aid programs, measured as effective in one way or another, tend to align with those priorities that are already endemic in a region. So again, it's worth asking about the religious motivations and functioning of NGOs. Do they work because they're motivated by religious ideas of charity, to the least of those? Right? Do they work because they want to use aid as an enticement to conversion for those who aren't Christian or Muslim? Mercy Corps, for example, is motivated by a Christian belief in charity, but does not mention Christianity when working in the field. World Vision, on the other hand, is more overt about its evangelical commitments up front and behind the scenes, though they'll work with anybody. And despite the Cross and Crescent, the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Society is actually a secular organization. Which is to say, you have to do your homework. You're going to have any idea about who you might be sending that $10 to because they hit you up on Facebook. And I think it's worth thinking about. So I'll just conclude by saying it's worth knowing who you're giving to. Know how they work. Because it matters, certainly for the Afghans, but also for you as a giver. What are your motivations in giving? And what do you expect in return?
Thank you. So I'm going to quickly give everybody an opportunity to ask any clarifying questions they have to Dr. Lamoreaux or Dr. DeTemple before we move over into the second portion of the episode. Any clarifying questions from anybody?
Give a clarifying comment.
Okay.
And so we're seeing sort of on the right-leaning spectrum of the evangelical organizations asking for money to rescue Christians in Afghanistan. We're talking about thousands of Christians who need to be rescued. I would be very suspicious of numbers like that. There is little evidence to support. There are Christians in Afghanistan, but nothing like that. 100, maybe 150. Apostasy from Islam, even under the U.S. occupation, was a capital crime in Afghanistan. So anyone who did convert, especially after 2005, tended to leave the country. I worry that some Christian organizations are using this specter of trapped Christians that fleece the unwary.
Okay.
Not least Glenn Beck.
It's good to know. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and transition into kind of a time of dialogue and just kind of consideration on this question of how, not only how should a Christian respond, but what does it look like for Christians to be thoughtfully thinking through how they respond to everything that's happening in Afghanistan? And so, with that being said, with Reverend Garvin being the university chaplain, I'm going to go ahead and let her start this portion. And so, floor is yours.
Thanks. So, in response to the question, what is a Christian response to the situation in Afghanistan? I don't think there is one response that is appropriate or expected of every Christian. But I do think that there's one response that is not appropriate for any Christian, and that is nothing. And I really appreciate that we started with sort of educating ourselves on what is the situation in Afghanistan, and what is the history of that. As I reflected on this question, the first biblical text that came to mind for me is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And you all will recall that in this story, Jesus is responding to a lawyer who's trying to test him and who asks, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responds with a question to the lawyer, "What does the law say?" And the lawyer gives the answer. The law says that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. To which the lawyer responds, "Well, who's my neighbor?" And that is when Jesus tells us the story of the Good Samaritan. In the story, a priest and a Levite, both religious, God-fearing people, see this injured man and walk around him and do nothing. But it is a Samaritan, the person that would least be expected to help this man, presumably a Jew, a person of a different tribe, a different ethnicity. Pick your difference, they were different, who offered care to the injured man. And so together, Jesus and presumably the lawyer agree that a neighbor is one who shows mercy. So what does that parable say to us, considering what a Christian response is in Afghanistan? Well, we certainly have the option as American Christians to walk on the other side. We live half a world away, and we literally could ignore it if we chose to do that. But I think that we are called to show mercy. I'm a United Methodist clergy person, and I'm specifically a deacon. So I'm ordained to connect the church to the world. And I feel pretty strongly that we're called to be engaged in the world, both locally and globally. Someone in the room, I've got my book of discipline with me as a good Methodist. And I have joked that I've carried it around too much lately, but we have a social creed that is a concise articulation of the United Methodist Church's commitment to live out our faith in the world. And we regularly review and update what we call our social principles, which are, quote, a prayerful and thoughtful effort on the part of the church to speak to the human issues in the contemporary world from a sound biblical and theological foundation. There are multiple excerpts from the social creed and our social principles that inspire my thinking about my own response and the response of other Christians, as well as the role of the church or Christians collectively in response to something like what's happening in Afghanistan. First, there is one stanza in the social creed that says, "We dedicate ourselves to peace throughout the world, to the rule of justice and law among nations, and to individual freedom for all people of the world." And then in our social principles, we divide those into 6 categories, and the world community is one of those categories. The introduction to that section states, "God's world is one world. We commit ourselves as a church to the achievement of a world community that is a fellowship of persons who honestly love one another. We pledge ourselves to seek the meaning of the gospel in all issues that divide people and threaten the growth of world community." And then the last excerpt that I'll share is there's another category in those 6, which is the political community. And it includes a section on basic freedom and human rights. And that section reads in part, "We hold governments responsible for the protection of the rights of the people to free and fair elections and to the freedoms of speech, religion, assembly, communications, media, and petition for redress of grievances without fear of reprisal, as well as the guarantee of rights to adequate food, clothing, shelter, education, and health care." That same statement rejects political intimidation, as well as mistreatment, torture, and other cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment or punishment of persons by governments. And I could go on. The social principle includes statements and commitments around women and men, equality in the relationship between the genders, around rights of religious minorities, as well as more statements on justice and the rule of law that I think are pertinent to contemporary concerns in Afghanistan. You might hear in all this, there's sort of an assumption of democracy. And there is a reasonable critique that these social principles are U.S.-centric, but we're all speaking in the U.S. here. Generally speaking, they carry no authority with any governmental body in Afghanistan or the U.S., but they do inspire, I think, a Christian response to conflict and suffering throughout the world. So for me, a Christian response to the situation in Afghanistan can and should include the following. Partly what we've done here is to educate ourselves on the situation. What is happening and why is it happening? What is the root of the conflict? We cannot help and we risk doing harm, I think, if we do not understand what is happening first. And I would venture to guess that many of us who are interested in maybe even listening to this don't know a lot of the history that we heard at the beginning. I have very vague memories. A lot of this has happened in my lifetime, and I have very vague memories as a 3rd grader of the overthrow and then the things that have happened since then. But many, JT, your generation didn't live through most of it, right? And you're inheriting a lot of this. The U.S. has been at war during most of our students. The U.S. has been there during most of our students' lives. So we have to first educate ourselves on what's happening and what help looks like. I think a second response is advocating for political interventions with our leadership, whether that be global, national, or local leaders. This might mean intervention by international peacekeepers. It has implications on the relationships between our home country, for us, the U.S., and Afghanistan, as well as, I think, national. Dr. DeTemple talked about NGOs doing work on the ground in Afghanistan, but I think it also has implications on national and local policies related to immigration, asylum, and care for refugees. And then finally, I think contributing to humanitarian relief efforts, as Dr. DeTemple talked a lot about. There are ways to do that financially, but there are also ways to do that with your own time and gifts, and volunteering with any number of agencies that are providing support and hospitality for refugees is another opportunity. And then finally, I would say that supporting friends who are impacted by the events in Afghanistan. We've heard a lot in the media about U.S. military personnel who spent time in Afghanistan, who committed their lives believing and hoping that they were contributing to peace and justice. And, we're deeply disappointed, I think, when it fell apart in less than 2 days. Many are devastated and are carrying a burden. And so checking on those people that we know or whom we have contact with, I think, is one faithful response. And then I personally have a friend whose father was Afghani, and she still has family who live in Afghanistan. And the last that I heard from her, they were unable to get out of the country. And so I think another faithful response is checking on anyone who has been impacted in a real way or who has loved ones in the region. And then finally, what might have been first for some is to pray. To pray daily for the people of Afghanistan and for peace around the world. And I'm of the opinion that prayer is essential, but it is not enough.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the platform over to Dr. Matthew Wilson, and he will be giving a Catholic perspective with his expertise in political studies kind of arming him educationally as well.
So I've been assigned to speak on behalf of the Vatican. Well, I can't do that authoritatively.
No, but you are practicing Catholic as far as I am aware.
Yes, indeed. But my comments are going to be applicable to Christians more broadly.
Yes.
Not specifically just to adherents of the Catholic faith. And I want to raise a few issues that I think are really thorny that Christians have to grapple with in bringing their conscience to bear in evaluating the situation in Afghanistan. And one of those is that I think Christians are called to advocate for and, to the extent possible, to materially and practically support fundamental Christian values as they apply on the ground. But building on something that Reverend Garvin said, we have to be very careful in distinguishing between what are truly fundamental Christian moral principles and Western cultural preferences. Now, that does not mean that there's no such thing as fundamental Christian principles and it's all just Western imperialism. That's not what I'm saying at all. But certainly there's a historical record of Western cultural preferences being imbued with the improper moral authority of genuine underlying Christian values. And here's what I mean as an example. Let's take, for example, the treatment of women in Afghanistan. Now, there are some aspects of that that truly impinge on fundamental Christian moral values. There are other aspects of that that are Western cultural practices. I think, for example, it is a fundamental Christian moral principle to say that a woman in Afghanistan or anywhere should not be subject to an honor killing because she is raped. That's a fundamental moral value. It is not a fundamental moral value to say that women in Afghanistan should be free to wear miniskirts if they want. That's our Western preference, to give people that sort of freedom and discretion. But those two things are not of the same order, right? And we have to be able to discern what is just a very different way of looking at how people operate in the world from what is truly a moral non-negotiable in terms of people's fundamental rights and human dignity. And I think that can be tricky, right? That can be a tricky thing to bring to bear. Another issue that I think is critically important as Christians think about the situation in Afghanistan is the issue of religious liberty. Dr. Lamoreaux raised this, essentially pointing out that there is no such thing as religious liberty in Afghanistan. That, in fact, not only is a particular religion privileged, and not only are adherents of other faiths sanctioned, but in fact, apostasy is a capital offense. It is essentially, to be an Afghan and to become a Christian is a death sentence. That's something that Christians should care about deeply. That's reflected in the statement from the Book of Discipline, that a fundamental Christian value is religious liberty. Now, to be sure, if we're honest about the history of Christianity, we realize that this is not a principle that has been universally observed by Christians, right? We've got plenty of historical examples of both Catholic and Protestant Christians who did not extend religious liberty. Look at the New England Puritans. Look at the Spanish Inquisition, right? I mean, we can point to historical examples where this did not exist. However, in the modern teaching of Christian churches, there has been a growing emphasis on the ability to truly and freely, as a matter of conscience, to choose faith. Because ultimately, Christians believe that if one is free to proclaim the gospel will win out. Over the long haul, right? And so the long haul, in a Christian perspective, can be a very long haul. But I completely agree with Dr. Lamoreaux. The number of Afghan Christians is certainly quite small. It's not zero. Part is we don't know what the number is, precisely because they have to be in hiding, right? Anybody who's a Christian in Afghanistan either leaves or has got to be in deep hiding. But it's a small number. I mean, almost certainly. Whether it's 100 or 1,000, it's in the rounding error of the total population of Afghanistan. Which is not to say we shouldn't care about those people, but there's not a large Christian community on whose behalf Christians globally can engage. But Christians globally can engage on behalf of religious freedom and conscience rights as a moral principle. Even if that means, for example, caring about religious freedom for Shia Muslims, who are a significant religious minority in Afghanistan. Caring about their freedom to practice their faith. Right? One of the great crimes of the Taliban was destroying Buddhist art, right? The famous Buddhas that they blasted to oblivion in one of their acts of cultural desecration. Even though that was not Christian art, that should still grieve Christians for a variety of different reasons. Right? So I think that's an important principle to bring to bear, to fight what we can for religious liberty. The last point that I'll make, and this is a really tough one when it comes to the work of the NGOs and the humanitarian work that Professor DeTemple was talking about. What do we do when we believe that doing humanitarian work, building roads, cleaning water supply, creating infrastructure, helping to establish civil order, right? All the things that these NGOs would like to do. What do we do when we believe that that humanitarian work is simultaneously bolstering the authority and legitimacy of a regime that we think is fundamentally evil? Right? Because making Afghanistan work today is going to help the Taliban gain legitimacy and stay in power. Right? Because ironically, these Christian NGOs and the Taliban, in the short term, they want many of the same things. Right? They both want Afghanistan to be functional because that will help quell resistance against the Taliban. It will also help a lot of ordinary Afghans live a better life. What kind of moral trade-offs, though, does that entail? When our very efforts to help people are bolstering the authority of a regime that does horrific and brutal things in the area of religious liberty, women's rights, a whole host of other issues. That's a tough one. I don't have an easy answer. I don't have, and the Christian answer is X. Because these are very thorny moral trade-offs to wrestle with. But there are things that I think every Christian approaching the situation in Afghanistan should think about deeply and prayerfully.
100%. So for sake of time, so we can have some time to respond, I'm going to give Dr. Ben Voth and Dr. Steve Long 5 minutes to try and crush through their thoughts each, and we'll start with Dr. Voth.
All right, thank you, JT. And my background on this, I've written a couple of books. I've written 4 books, but 2 of them really bear on the question of genocide and how we might think more constructively about ending genocide in the 21st century. And I have to say, I don't have a really optimistic read about Taliban 2.0. I do think that their rhetoric is rather clear to the point that they intend to be as gruesome as they have ever been. By that, I want to specifically say, they've said in the past couple of weeks that they will continue the practice of relatives will carry out the capital punishment public events, which they've done in the past. They've also said that their national security depends upon being able to cut people's hands off in public. They have also said publicly in their rhetoric that they intend to have a global empire, a global reach of their view. I also believe factually that there are 4 members of the government that were detained at Guantanamo Bay. And so now they're in the government. So I think there is a very real risk of genocide from this government. I think that's the awkward, painful reality, the shadow that we have to respond to. And I kind of have a quotation from the book that I think is important. And it's kind of, in our hearts. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, "What hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander." And so I really want to commend you just for at least having a podcast where we talk about it and people are going to listen and think about it, because I actually do think there is value in that. And I actually don't mind saying this evening that I disagree with the kind of the idea that there's only like 100 Christians in Afghanistan. I think there are multiple sources that pretty, I think, confidently put the number closer to 10 and 12,000, as you said. But let me just give an example. There's a single house church in Afghanistan that's been pretty well identified, I think, by World Magazine, that has 500 members. 30 of them put their Christian identity on the Afghan ID cards before Afghanistan came to power. Now, I want to be clear, just as we have said, that is super dangerous. To do that is to almost be a death sentence. 20 of them were not able to complete that process, but we know that 30 of them did. So I think our hearts ought to be torn about what can happen to these people. And I do think, whether the Taliban like to think about this or not, whether there's 100 or 12,000, this is a genocide if they really were to carry out and kill all these people. I also think, as has already been said, that the Shia minority is at risk. We, for example, in my book, my 2014 book, there's an appendix in there written by one of my students here from SMU. She was president of our debate team. Voth Raza, her family was nearly killed in Pakistan as a Shia minority in that predominantly kind of Sunni culture. And so there is a history of the Taliban doing this with Shia, as we've already said. And so I think there should be public concern. I guess I would also echo something the chaplain said earlier, which is that we ought to make effort to valorize what U.S. military have sacrificed, especially in the last 20 years, for the good, especially of women, girls who were educated and things like that. And there's a risk that they would think that their efforts were in vain and pointless. We actually know that life expectancy went up. We know that educational outcomes improved. We know that family incomes actually improved because these women got these educations over decades. And it's important to valorize sacrifices. And yes, people who died in the country trying to save lives. This is something where I think a lot of people disagree with this. This is something I would agree with President Biden about when he said of the U.S. Marines that they are like the prophet Isaiah. Here am I, send me. A lot of people on left and right got very angry at that comment. But U.S. military personnel who risk their lives to try to save human life in foreign locales, I think should be valorized. I think the local communities right now, you can do that and try to provide some relief to their minds on this. And again, to be very honest, in conclusion, I would just say I think there is some risk, just like in Iraq, that we might return and try to help from a military standpoint, stabilize the country and reduce the risk of genocide. But that's kind of my main heart for the matter and sort of what I would urge Christians to think about going forward. But JT, thanks for giving time to do that.
100%. Dr. Long, the floor is yours, and around 5:50, we're gonna return, and each of you is going to kind of have 2 minutes to kind of respond collectively to everything that's been said.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for your comments. It's wonderful to be in a place where moral matters can be debated. My task is to think about this in terms of Christian ethics, and I would say in terms of Christian ethics, generally, there are only two appropriate positions for Christian participation in violence. And these two positions overlap. They have some discontinuities, they have some continuities. That is the just war teaching and pacifism. Now, I would argue that from, if I had more time, it's not from a simple command of Scripture. You could argue it from, as Tertullian did, that in unbelting Peter, Jesus unbelted every soldier, which was viewed as a fairly universal command in the first couple of centuries. Or the Sermon on the Mount, or just the main symbol of Christianity, which says that, the most innocent one took upon himself death and suffering, and of course was raised from the dead. So I think those are the only two positions, and I think what they share in common and should be emphasized is a presumption against violence. They share in common that peace is more ontologically prior than violence. So violence is what has to be justified, not peace. Those of us who refuse to arm ourselves, those of us who refuse to call the police on our neighbors, those of us who have real questions about the military budget of this country, are not the ones who should justify ourselves in terms of the Christian faith. It's those who would take up violence, those who would arm themselves, those who would advocate for continued expansion of the military budget. I think somehow, as Christians, they're the ones who need to justify themselves. And it possibly can be done. I think we should have a good, healthy debate about that. We haven't had it for 20 years, as far as I'm concerned, and that deeply troubles me. I'm old enough to remember watching Vietnam as a child, worried about being called out. I was a little too young, but watching people get slaughtered on the evening news because you saw it more regularly. And I remember the debates we had when I went to an evangelical college in the 70s. In my organic chemistry class, we read Mark Hatfield's Between a Rock and a Hard Place. And I was confronted with what does it mean to be a follower of Christ and to take up arms. And that has haunted me. Before I even met the well-known pacifist Stanley Hauerwas, I've been haunted by this question. I think anybody who reads Scripture has to be haunted by it. I don't think we've had those conversations because I think one of the deep, deep problems we face right now is we've outsourced our military violence. We've outsourced it to a very few people. Over the last 20 years, every time I teach ethics, I ask students in the class, how many of you have been directly impacted by 20 years of war? 2 or 3. Every time. And that, I think what we've done is we've created a kind of military culture that does our violence for us, that to call into question and raise critical questions about is somehow viewed as dangerous, immoral, unethical, and that's creating an insular military culture, which is not, and I think this is the problem in Afghanistan with our 20 years of this horrific and unsuccessful war, which then does not subordinate the military to political ends. If you are going to justify violence and warfare on just war terms, it has to be subordinated to political ends. And my deep, deep problem with what has gone on in Afghanistan is that it might have been at first. Once Al-Qaeda left, if we had said, okay, we've accomplished our goal and we leave, that's fine. But a war on terror, you never have an end, because you cannot destroy terror with violence unless you become like the terrorists themselves. So that's my concern, is where do we have this conversation? As a United Methodist elder, I've also read the Book of Discipline, and in our Book of Discipline it says that pastors are required, it's a requirement, to counsel military service and its alternatives. It's in our Book of Discipline. But if you have that conversation in the life of the Christian church today, it would be fraught with controversy. You would probably lose your parish. You can't even have any conversation like this. I mean, I do these kinds of things in Sunday school classes because I get to lead. That really troubles me. I also think that in terms of this war, we have to remember that according to the Cost of War project at Brown University, it cost $8 trillion and 900,000 people killed. The majority of them civilians. Anand Gopal's reporting I find very compelling. I don't know. I did spend a week in Peshawar, Pakistan in 1986, seeing the United Methodist Project with the General Board of Church and Society distributing aid, and I think it was a good aid. There was no, Methodists don't really proselytize, to the Mujahideen who had left because of the communist revolution, and which had gone on for about 7 years at that point, the Soviet invasion, and but I don't know, and who does know? I mean, there's so many different ways of narrating what's going on. But Anand Gopal argues that there's a real divide between Kabul, which is a basically liberal city, and rural Afghanistan. And he interviews this woman named Shakira in the rural area who was embedded with the Taliban. And she says, how can you give the rights of women to Afghanis in Kabul while you kill us in Helmand province? And I think that the task of Christians in America right now is the Christian life is a process of confession repentance, and reconciliation, until all the nations of the world come together and celebrate peace and reconciliation in the realm of God. I think that's what we're hoping for, and anything less than that is not to be expected. But I think our task right now is to ask not about, of course we have to ask these critical questions about others, but also about our own simplicity, about our own style, about what happened, why were we so taken with Obama that we allowed him to intensify the drone strikes, and many of them so indiscriminate. And whether or not we all need to bear more of a cost, whether it's through mandatory conscription and alternative service, so that we don't create a military culture which is isolated from political and cultural realities.
Holy cow, my brain is fried processing everything that's being said. So I'm not going to talk. I'm going to turn it back over to Reverend Garvin. We're going to kind of go through the same order we did. Just kind of reactions to everything that's been said collectively. You've got 2 minutes.
Well, I mean, 2 minutes to gather those thoughts. I was too busy listening. I think, the complexity of it is what stands out, obviously, and a Christian commitment to caring for one another in a way that builds justice and peace, right? And I think we've all sort of pointed to that there's not an easy answer to that.
Yeah.
And the faithful response is to sort of thoughtfully and faithfully consider what you can do and what you're called to do.
100%. Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, I think the most important thing for people to keep in mind is, and we've all kind of alluded to this, there's not a kind of single obvious Christian path here. It is true that whatever course we advocate, whether we advocate intervention, either militarily or in terms of political, economic aid, or we advocate non-intervention, that we be realistic about what the alternative is, what the choice is that we're making. It's very easy to criticize someone's policy of either intervention or non-intervention with an unrealistic alternative scenario where, if only we hadn't done this, everything would have worked out fine. In all likelihood, it wouldn't have, right? In all likelihood, what we're choosing is between multiple deeply flawed and undesirable alternatives. And that's, this puts me in mind of when people criticized the war in Iraq. And there were a lot of very justifiable criticisms to level against the war in Iraq. But if we're going to do that, we need to be intellectually honest about what we're choosing instead. And that is to own the continuance, in that case, of Saddam Hussein in power. And we might very well say that is the morally preferable alternative. As bad as Saddam Hussein being in power is, that's better than the military costs, the humanitarian costs of war. Perfectly legitimate argument. But it does require not obfuscating the alternative, being honest about it and saying, yes, we have chosen whatever brutality emerges from the Saddam Hussein regime as the lesser of two evils, right? As the alternative to military intervention. The same thing's true in Afghanistan. And not allow ourselves to take the easy path of constructing unrealistic alternative scenarios if only they chose my path, right? And that's something for all of us, no matter what it is that we're advocating from a Christian moral standpoint.
Dr. Voth?
Yeah, I'm just going to conclude with an anecdote from my experiences in Rwanda in 2019. I was there, obviously, in the 25th anniversary of the genocide, where 1.4 million people were slaughtered in 100 days. It's certainly one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. I was there worshiping on a Sunday, and most of what was being said and sung was in Kinyarwanda, which is not a language that I know. But honestly, it was very passionate, it was very heartfelt, and I might have been the only white person in the room, but tears were flowing for me just hearing the passion of these Rwandans worshiping God. And I was interrupted in my thoughts when a woman leaned over to me and said in English, this large black woman said, "We do this because Jesus saved our nation." And I found that very stirring because in my research there for 3 weeks, I've been there in 2017 as well, I have to say it is still shocking to me why the genocide ever stopped. I mean, the Hutus were able to kill 1.4 million Tutsis in 100 days, and why it stopped, like roughly around July 4th, 1994, is very difficult to say. And what she was saying in that worship service could be exactly what happened. And I guess I want to just say in conclusion to everybody, just thank God that you even care to talk about Afghanistan. And I would just say, please don't adopt any fatalistic view from anything anybody has said. Say, I'll just never give this another thought. And please just have a mental discipline and a heart discipline of saying, what about the 30 million people who live in Afghanistan? And if you would do that much for the days, weeks, months, and years to come, I would consider that, God's calling on your life. And so that's all I would just say in conclusion about what to do about Afghanistan.
100%. Dr. Long?
I always enjoy these conversations, and I've learned a great deal. I appreciate what Dr. Voth quoted from Elie Wiesel. I think that's exactly right. In the United States, I wish we would develop an imaginative possibility that one way of not being a bystander is something other than sending in the Marines. I think if anything, these 20 years, and I'm not criticizing anybody who went. I come from a long line of people who served in the military. I have not. And I think one of the things we need are just imaginative possibilities before we get to Rwanda. I mean, by the time you get to Rwanda, it's really too late to do ethics. That's the problem. Part of the task of ethics and moral formation, and I hope in the lives of our churches, is to figure out how we can avoid Rwanda. And Lord knows right now, given what we're going through in the United States, I read an article by Michael Pearson, I think it was in the Post of the Times today, where, and he's no liberal, right? I mean, he was saying we have to start cultivating nonviolent resistance so that we don't kill each other in the coming civil war. Now, I don't know if that's a hyperbolic or what, but I do think if we don't figure out how to engage with one another through rational deliberation, it is something more than just a will to power, that it's more difficult to avoid Rwanda.
Thank you, everyone. One, as far as I'm aware to date, this is the only thing that has been put together on this topic to date. So thank you, everyone. This has been tremendous for me, just being able to sit and listen and absorb the different perspectives and the amount of information that's just been dumped into this space. That being said, this has been the In Step with God podcast, and thank you, everyone.